Within the deep confines of ancient Pella, where the Macedonian hills wore their mist like a crown and the murmurs of Hellenic myth filtered through the very stone, there emerged a soul irrevocably fractured. You are not meant to see the boy, but the idea of him, a conflict forged at birth. The initial scene is not a court, but a shadowed chamber where lamplight flickers across the figure of his mother, Olympias, a woman obsessed with the esoteric and the prophecies of serpentine deities. She had instilled in her son one unshakable truth. He was not merely the son of Philippos II, the mortal king who had brutalized his way into Hellenic dominance through gold and sarissas, but the direct descendant of Zeus himself, or perhaps the spiritual heir of Achilles. Meanwhile, Philippos, the very real father, sought to anchor this chaotic ambition with the chain of reason. He placed Alexander under the tutelage of Aristotle, the foremost philosopher of the age, at Mieza. Thus, Alexander's soul became a perpetual battlefield. On one side, the sweet poison of divinity, urging him to transcend all limits. On the other, the stark, rational knowledge of the Greeks, teaching him how to conquer the world rather than simply dream of it. This contradiction would never truly leave him. He was simultaneously the warrior and the scholar, the god and the man. Imagine Alexander as a restless adolescent standing amidst the scrolls of Mieza, the scent of papyrus and ancient dust heavy in the air. He did not read Hesiod or Homer like other boys, he lived them. The narratives of the gods of Achilles and Heracles were not fairy tales, they were genealogical blueprints. But then he would turn to Aristotle, who was lecturing on politics, politeia, a mainstream historical fact, the foundational truth that to rule mortals one must first understand their laws and social architecture. This duality was the very engine that drove him forward. The soul understands that the price of such ambition is the loss of personal peace. You cannot be both deity and human simultaneously without paying the currency of absolute solitude. He would conquer the entire known world, not to affirm himself to that world, but to affirm it to himself. Was he the logos, reason of Aristotle, or the mythos, myth of Olympias? He needed a boundary to break, a rival to eclipse. It was during one fated afternoon that Alexander witnessed his father Philippos and the elder courtiers mocking a colossal, untamed stallion, Bucephalus, which none could master. The creature was notoriously wild and peculiar, a quirky tidbit that marked it as distinct. Everyone feared its power, save Alexander. He observed that the horse was not frightened by the lash or the noise, but by the movement of its own shadow. Alexander quietly guided Bucephalus to face the sun, eliminating the cause of its terror, and rode it. That moment was the fated fracture. It was not brute force, but psychological insight that won the day. He had achieved what Philippos and lesser men could not. He had found his companion, an emblem of his own being, a formidable entity, terrified only by its own reflection. It was the silent declaration of war by a son against a father, a demigod against the purely mortal. This philosophical conflict was pervasive. It is a mainstream historical fact that Aristotle truly tutored Alexander at Mieza, providing him with instruction in ethics, politics, and science, forming the rational basis for his strategic genius. Yet, as he later charged across continents, historians still argue whether the logos of Aristotle ever truly superseded the mythos of his mother. Did his tutor merely sharpen the tools for his chaotic divine drive? Now let that complexity settle into your mind as the sword and reason begin their joint journey. Alexander is ready to write history, and that history, you feel, will be written in blood. The incident with Bucephalus, that triumph of turning the horse toward the sun, was more than a mere display of princely talent. It was a prophetic action. It taught the young Alexander that fear was not a substance, but a mere reflection cast upon the curtain of darkness. If he could master the shadow of a beast, he silently wondered, could he master the colossal shadow of his own father that loomed over the known world? Philippos II was a military phenomenon. He had not only unified Greece, but had created the Macedonian phalanx, a military machine unmatched in its era, a testament to the mainstream historical fact that Philippos's reign provided the formidable material foundation for everything Alexander would later claim. But for Alexander, Philippos's career was a curse, a desperate race against time and inevitability. He watched his father, a man scarred and often drunk, wounds Alexander saw as marks of mortality, constantly expanding the frontiers. Alexander once famously lamented, "My father will get ahead of me. He will leave me no great feat to perform." He lived in terror not of failure itself, but of falling into ordinariness. He feared inheriting a kingdom that was merely governed, rather than one that was perpetually conquered. In the atmosphere of the Macedonian court, the divinity whispered by Olympias clashed head-on with the pragmatism demanded by Philippos. Philippos sought a great king. Olympias demanded a living god. This perpetual opposition created an Alexander constantly questioning his own identity. He carried with him the personal copy of the Iliad edited by Aristotle himself, a quirky tidbit illustrating his dedication, and held Achilles as the ultimate benchmark. He slept with the text beneath his pillow, treating it less like poetry and more like a tactical map toward eternal glory. His youth was a blur of aggressive hunts, intense philosophical seminars, and political skirmishes with the old generals who only saw him as the king's promising but volatile heir. Alexander knew he had to prove himself. At 16, he was left as regent while his father campaigned. At 18, he was given a crucial command at the decisive Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. You find yourself on the dusty plains of Chaeronea, standing beside the prince. This was no ordinary skirmish. It was the final subjugation of free Greece. The mainstream historical fact is that Alexander led the companion cavalry, shattering the formidable sacred band of Thebes, a force of 300 devoted pairs of male lovers sworn to die together. He brutally extinguished an ancient symbol of Hellenic ideal, a mythical force of courage, with a single cold tactical strike. The victory was his first real taste of divine power, but it was tinged with a complex guilt. He had proven his mettle, but only in service to his father's ambition, not his own. He felt the terrifying silence of those 300 brave souls and wondered, was this my glory? Or just a footnote in the great king's epic? The tension between them climaxed when Philippos chose to marry Cleopatra Eurydice, the niece of General Attalus. At the wedding feast, Attalus, in a brazen toast, prayed for the queen to produce legitimate heirs to the Macedonian throne. This was a public insult to Alexander and Olympias, implying Alexander was a bastard heir, whether by Olympias, a non-Macedonian, or by the gods. His legitimacy was challenged. Alexander exploded, throwing a wine cup and shouting at Attalus. Philippos, drunk and enraged, drew his sword, lunged at his son, but stumbled and fell. Alexander stood over his prone father and delivered a devastating philosophical put-down, a moment of profound, dark humor, a gentle joke if you view it through the lens of tragic irony. Look, men, the man who is preparing to cross from Europe to Asia cannot even cross from one couch to the next without falling. That remark, laced with contempt and wit, marked the final break. Alexander and Olympias fled into exile, separated from Macedon by a father he both revered and loathed. During that brief exile, the question of his divine parentage became a consuming obsession. Legend holds that Alexander sought out the oracle at Delphi for consultation before his campaign, only to be rejected by the Pythia because it was not the appointed day. Alexander, refusing to accept mortal delay, stormed the temple and physically dragged the priestess toward the chamber. The terrified, exhausted old woman could only gasp, "My son, you are invincible!" This moment, a quirky tidbit demonstrating Alexander's tyrannical impatience, shows he didn't merely ask for prophecy. He forced it. Historians still argue whether the feud between Philippos and Alexander was truly personal and familial, or if it was a purely political struggle over the strategic direction of the kingdom. Regardless of the reason, the episode made Alexander sharper and more ruthless. He returned to Pella, awaiting his historical moment, and it did not keep him waiting long. The simmering tension, that dark philosophical conflict between the mortal king and the son of a deity, was resolved not by debate, but by a dagger. You are standing in the theater of Aegae in 336 BC, amidst the pomp and celebration of Philippos's latest marriage. It is a moment of high drama and deep irony. Philippos, ever the pragmatic showman, had dramatically dismissed his bodyguards, proclaiming his security lay with the love of the Macedonian people and the alliances he forged. It was a calculated risk, a masterful piece of political theater. But theater, Alexander knew, can always be interrupted. The mainstream historical fact is that Philippos II was assassinated by Pausanias, one of his own bodyguards, during this public procession. The motive remains obscured by the shadows of political intrigue. Was it Olympias, the spurned queen, whose vipers and fierce loyalties reached out from exile? Was it the Persians, eager to cripple their imminent invader? Or was it the subtle manipulation of Alexander himself, eager to seize the reins before his destiny evaporated? Historians still argue whether Alexander was directly complicit in the assassination of his father, or merely the chief beneficiary of the tragedy. For Alexander, the question was irrelevant. The sword had cleared the stage. The moment the dagger struck, the air changed. The chaotic scramble that followed was Alexander's true baptism. He was instantly hailed as king, but the throne he inherited was built on shifting sand. To the south, the Greeks, whom Philippos had brutally subdued, saw a chance for freedom. To the north, barbarian tribes smelled weakness. Alexander had to perform an act of pure, distilled violence to secure his right to rule. He launched a brutal purge of rivals and perceived threats. Any male with even the faintest claim to the throne, any general whose loyalty might waver, was swiftly and mercilessly eliminated. He wiped out his cousin Amyntas and, crucially, ordered the death of the infant son of Cleopatra Eurydice. This was the first time the sword had been wielded purely for self-preservation and ascent, not for external conquest. The act was chillingly clinical, demonstrating a necessary ruthlessness that belied his 20 years. He was establishing the principle that the pursuit of immortality, the drive for the divine destiny, trumped all mortal, familial, or moral bonds. Remember the fall of his father at the wedding feast? Now, Alexander was ensuring no one would stand over him again. In this ascent, the shadow of Philippos was not merely overcome, it was absorbed. Alexander adopted the rhetoric, the army structure, and the grand plan of conquering Persia. The very plan his father had meticulously prepared, but he infused it with his own mythological fervor. Where Philippos promised gold and land, Alexander promised a glorious, terrifying, unprecedented future. The Athenians, led by the orator Demosthenes, were quick to seize the moment, spreading the quirky tidbit, though later discredited, that Alexander had been killed alongside his father. This political opportunism forced Alexander into immediate, brutal action. In 335 BC, he marched swiftly south, crushing the Greek revolt with a precision that shocked the city-states. Thebes, however, became the terrible demonstration of his new sovereignty. When the Thebans rose up, Alexander besieged the city. When it fell, he ordered its complete destruction, save for the temples and, poignantly, the house of the poet Pindar. The massacre was horrific. The city razed to the ground, its 30,000 inhabitants sold into slavery. This was his response to being called merely the boy. This was the language of a king who commanded armies and who understood, perhaps better than anyone, the tactical value of terror. The Theban destruction became the ultimate callback to Chaeronea. He had finally and permanently broken the spirit of the free Greek city-states. Now Alexander stood on the foundation built by Philippos, but with a gaze fixed solely on his own destiny. He had secured Macedonia, brutally silenced Greece, and inherited the finest fighting force in the world. He was the unquestioned supreme commander of the Hellenic world. The next step was inevitable, almost a chore assigned by fate, the long-planned invasion of Persia. He wasn't marching for Philippos's revenge. He was marching for his own divinity. He had eliminated the rival gods. Now he would seek the arena of the ultimate mortal king, Darius, to prove his claim. With the Theban ashes still cooling, a terrible object lesson delivered to the heart of Greece, Alexander stood at the precipice of his true ambition. The world, as imagined by the Macedonians and the Persians, was divided by one narrow stretch of water, the Hellespont. Now, in 334 BC, you watch him arrive on the shores of that strait, the border between Europe and Asia. This crossing was not a mere military maneuver. It was a deeply symbolic and philosophical moment of commitment. He was, quite literally, leaving behind the realm of his father's direct achievements and entering the grand, unpredictable theater of his own potential divinity. The mainstream historical fact is that the invasion force consisted of roughly 48,000 men. This number is itself a testament to Philippos's meticulous preparation and Alexander's brutal efficiency in securing the Greek leagues. Yet Alexander's mind was not on logistics. He landed at Troy, the site immortalized by Homer, his beloved roadmap to glory. In a moment of theatrical piety that would define his entire campaign, he discarded his royal Macedonian armor and donned a suit said to have belonged to Achilles himself. He paid homage at the tomb of Achilles, declaring his lineage and destiny. This act was vital for two audiences. For his own troops, who were wary of the vastness of the Persian Empire, it transformed the invasion from a political war of revenge, Philippos's narrative, into a divine crusade, Alexander's narrative. For Alexander himself, it marked a decisive rejection of the past. He was shedding the persona of the mere Macedonian king, the son of Philippos, and embracing his role as the Hellenic champion, the spiritual successor to the demigod Achilles. He had finally stepped out of his father's shadow and into the glaring, untamed light of his own creation. Standing on the Asian shore, he took his spear, his constant companion and implement of fate, and drove it into the sand, staking his claim to the entire continent. The act was audacious, a moment of almost childlike simplicity fused with imperial arrogance. From that moment, retreat was psychologically impossible. He was no longer a visitor or an invader. He was reclaiming what was rightfully, divinely his. This self-deification caused friction almost immediately. The Persian Empire was not a cohesive monolith, but a vast, sophisticated tapestry of satrapies and nations ruled by the Achaemenid dynasty, led by Darius III. The Persian strategy, advised by the brilliant Greek mercenary Memnon of Rhodes, was simple. Avoid a pitched battle and use the vastness of the territory to draw Alexander's supply lines thin. This intelligent, quirky tidbit, a Greek fighting for the Persians, highlights the cultural fluidity of the region, where loyalty was often professional rather than national. Alexander dismissed the counsel of his senior general Parmenion, who advised against confronting the Persian satraps immediately. Parmenion, the old-school pragmatist who embodied Philippos's caution, suggested waiting. Alexander, driven by the divine impatience of Achilles, refused. He needed a battle, a decisive early victory to validate his sacred claim and to inject fear into the sprawling body of the Persian beast. His psychological state at this juncture was characterized by an unnerving blend of the rational and the spiritual. He carried Aristotle's wisdom, the need to secure coastal routes, the importance of naval denial. Yet he executed these rational goals with the furious abandon of a warrior seeking death in the arms of glory. He demanded a rapid, almost impossible pace, pushing his men across unfamiliar terrain under a scorching sun. He was driven by the fear that still lingered, not the fear of Bucephalus's shadow, but the lingering fear that the world might prove too small, that his father, or worse, mortality itself, might still outpace him. This haste underscores the profound truth that Alexander's war was never about geography, it was about speed. He believed that if he moved fast enough, fate could not catch him. Historians still argue whether Alexander's quick decision to engage the Persians at the Granicus River, despite Parmenion's caution, was an act of tactical genius or simply reckless megalomania. Regardless, the die was cast and the river lay ahead, waiting to run red with the first blood of the grand campaign. Section 5. The Granicus River flowed cold and deep, its banks lined with the waiting Persian cavalry, a formidable sight of gleaming bronze and scimitars. You stand with Alexander on the European side, the air thick with tension and the smell of fear that only massed horses can produce. This was no gentle skirmish. This was the moment of validation he desperately needed, the crucible that would either confirm his divine status or expose him as merely the ambitious son of a murdered king. The mainstream historical fact is that the Persian defense was strong, positioned on the high bank to leverage the advantage of elevation against any crossing attempt. Parmenion, the old general whose counsel still echoed the cautious pragmatism of Philippos, urged Alexander to wait until dawn, when an organized crossing could be managed. But Alexander, fueled by the impatient fire of Achilles, saw delay as weakness, a mortal concession. He believed the Persians expected rational tactics, and therefore irrational, lightning-fast courage would be his greatest weapon. You watch him plunge into the rushing water, leading the companion cavalry directly across the river and up the steep, muddy bank, a move that bordered on suicidal recklessness. He knew that the Persians' focus would be drawn to him, the king himself, drawing the main force into the river where their numbers and superior position were negated by the current and the slick terrain. This was the philosophy of personal risk elevated to a military strategy. The ensuing battle was a brutal, chaotic melee. Alexander found himself thrust directly into the thickest fighting, hacking his way through the ranks. In a moment of intense drama, a Persian nobleman named Mithridates raised his axe high above Alexander's head. You see Cletus the Black, a devoted general who would later pay the ultimate price for his honesty, intervene just in time, severing Mithridates' arm. It was a terrifying, almost fatal reminder that, despite the divine destiny whispered by his mother, the king's neck was still made of mortal flesh and bone. The victory was swift and absolute. The Macedonian losses were minimal compared to the staggering defeat of the Persian satraps and mercenary forces. This was the chilling lesson of Granicus. Alexander was not just a great general. He was a force of nature whose presence on the battlefield inspired a reckless, contagious bravery that shattered conventional military lines. He had taken on the entire regional power structure of the Persian Empire and destroyed it in an afternoon. But the victory was also tinged with a dark sense of betrayal. Among the slain were thousands of Greek mercenaries fighting for the Persians. Alexander, viewing these men not as professional soldiers but as traitors to the Hellenic cause, ordered their merciless execution or enslavement. This decision, though strategically intended to discourage further Greek enlistment, revealed the widening moral chasm between Alexander's idealistic Hellenic crusade and the brutal realities of his imperial ambition. He was purging the world of those who dared to reject his singular vision. As the sun set over the carnage, Alexander ordered that 300 suits of Persian armor, a quirky tidbit designed for political propaganda, be sent back to the Parthenon in Athens with an inscription. Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, except the Spartans, have dedicated these spoils, taken from the barbarians who dwell in Asia. Notice the chilling exclusion, except the Spartans. This was a cold, calculated slight against the independent spirit that dared to resist his hegemony back in Greece, reaffirming his mastery over the entire Hellenic world, living and conquered. The aftermath of Granicus changed Alexander. He had faced death, and through the sheer force of his destiny and the timely intervention of a mortal, survived. He felt invincible, yes, but also more isolated. His dependence on the loyalty of his men, now seen through the prism of Clytus's saving blow, became paramount, yet he resented that dependence. Historians still argue whether the battle's strategic significance lay in the military defeat of the Persians or in the psychological blow it delivered, convincing the people of Asia Minor that the Macedonian invasion was an irreversible tide. For Alexander, the question was settled. The gods favored him, and the rest of Asia was simply territory waiting to be claimed. He had secured the coast, denied the Persians' naval power, and now the interior beckoned, pulling him deeper into the mythic landscape he was born to conquer. With the initial bloody validation at Granicus secured, Alexander turned his attention away from the coastline, the rational, strategic objective, and toward the symbolic heartland of Asia Minor. The campaign became a rapid succession of cities opened, territories claimed, and crucially, temples visited. Each action was not just conquest, but a piece of performance art designed to cement his new quasi-divine authority. The Persian satraps were not the primary enemy now. The chief opponent was the skepticism of the conquered population, and more dangerously, the lingering doubts within his own Macedonian soul. He moved south through Ionia, restoring democracy to the Greek cities and symbolically freeing them from Persian tyranny. At Ephesus, in a characteristically grand gesture, he dedicated his future conquest to the goddess Artemis, establishing a direct link between his campaign and the ancient Hellenic deities. This was a mainstream historical fact. Alexander actively promoted Greek democratic ideals in Anatolia as part of his strategy to undermine the Persian autocracy, though this was often more rhetorical than actual, as he installed his own governors, satrapies. The march inevitably brought him to Phrygia, and specifically to its capital, Gordium, where the most famous obstacle of his early career awaited. The legend stated that whoever could successfully untie the intricate knot of cornel bark on the yoke of an ancient wagon would be destined to rule all of Asia. This was more than a puzzle. It was a profound prophetic barrier, a symbolic representation of the slow, methodical, complex way that fate was supposed to unfold. You can sense Alexander's profound impatience as he stares at the Gordian knot. He has no time for the millennia of slow unraveling. He views the tedious, rational approach of diplomacy or careful deliberation, the Philippos way, as beneath his divine mission. He sees the knot as the ultimate mortal constraint, binding him to the slow pace of human history. In a move of pure, breathtaking audacity, a defining, quirky tidbit of his legacy, he simply drew his sword, the very blade that secured his kingship, and slashed the knot in two. There was no patience, no reasoned attempt at untying, only the swift, brutal application of will. The knot was not defeated, it was denied. The philosophical implication of this act was profound. Alexander proclaimed that prophecy did not need to be fulfilled by careful adherence to rules. It could be violently commanded into existence. He redefined the very nature of destiny, asserting that his divine mandate allowed him to cut corners, to bypass complexity, and to impose simplicity onto the chaos of the future. The Gordian knot was not a sign of his patience, but of his contempt for conventional limits. This act cemented his persona as a leader who operated outside the parameters of normal human expectation, confirming the growing conviction among his troops that their leader was something more than mortal. He created his own myth, cutting through the old one. The campaign then veered towards the Cilician Gates, the narrow critical pass that was the gateway to Syria and the heartland of the Persian Empire. This was a dangerous choke point requiring utmost strategic patience. Here, Alexander was confronted by the brilliant Greek mercenary Memnon of Rhodes, who was successfully implementing a scorched earth strategy, denying Alexander supplies. However, Alexander learned of Memnon's death, a stroke of immense, almost unbelievable luck. Historians still argue whether Memnon's death at that critical moment was a turning point of greater importance than any single battle Alexander won. Had Memnon lived, his naval and land strategy might have strangled the Macedonian campaign before it reached the major Persian armies. For Alexander, it was further confirmation that the gods were clearing the path, not just for him, but ahead of him. With the threat of Memnon gone, Alexander plunged through the Cilician Gates, heading straight for the strategic plains of Syria, seeking the ultimate confrontation with the true source of his frustration, Darius III, the great king of Persia himself. The stage was set for the first direct, monumental collision between the West's restless ambition and the East's ancient sovereignty. The stage was set for the first true confrontation between the Logos of Macedonia and the ancient sovereignty of Persia. Alexander, driven by the belief that the gods cleared his path, a philosophical conviction cemented by Memnon's convenient death, pressed rapidly eastward. Darius III, the great king, was now mobilized, leading an army vast beyond Macedonian comprehension, a force said to number in the hundreds of thousands. The mainstream historical fact is that Darius III made a critical strategic error by moving his huge army away from the vast plains of Syria, where his superior numbers would have been decisive, into the narrow coastal plain of Issus. This terrain was a gift to Alexander. The constricted space nullified the Persian advantage in cavalry and sheer manpower, making the battle effectively a fight between two smaller, more manageable forces. Alexander recognized immediately that Darius, by leaving his strategic comfort zone, had inadvertently bowed to the impatient logic of the Macedonian spear. You are standing on the battlefield of Issus in 333 BC. The air is claustrophobic, trapped between the mountains and the sea. Alexander's strategy was pure, audacious genius, characterized by his personal aggression. He led the companion cavalry on the right flank, attacking directly where the Persian line was weakest, and then, in a terrifying diagonal charge, swung inward to strike Darius's own central command. The moment Alexander pierced the center was the psychological climax of the battle. You see the glint of his helmet, the furious movement of his companion cavalry, focused like a terrible sharp arrowhead aimed solely at the Persian heart. Darius, watching his personal guard crumble and faced with the terrifying specter of the Macedonian king himself, made the desperate choice. He fled. This flight, a shocking, quirky tidbit for the time, was not merely a tactical withdrawal. It was a profound failure of nerve that instantly demoralized his entire army and, more importantly, dismantled the mystical power of the great king's title. The result was a total rout. The Macedonians captured immense riches, and the battle was quickly over. But Alexander's most valuable trophies were not the gold or the chariots. They were Darius's family, his mother, Cynical, his wife, Statira, and his children. The capture of the royal family presented Alexander with a profound moral and psychological dilemma. When he visited them, he treated them with almost unprecedented respect and courtesy, assuring them of their safety. Cynical, initially bowing to Hyphasis, Alexander's tall, handsome general whom she mistook for the king, highlighted the cultural confusion. Alexander's response, "Do not worry, mother, for he too is Alexander," was not just a humorous aside. It was a subtle declaration of unity and shared divinity between himself and his closest companion. Why did Alexander show such restraint toward his mortal enemy's family? This act of clemency was the perfect synthesis of his two identities. As the rational student of Aristotle, he secured immense political leverage. He knew that treating the family well would undermine Darius's authority and encourage the loyalty of Persian nobles. But as the spiritual heir of Achilles, he was demonstrating an epic, almost chivalrous magnanimity, elevating the conflict from a mere war of conquest to a grand, Homeric struggle between titans who nevertheless understood the tragic beauty of war. He was proving he was not just a barbarian king, but a civilized, virtuous conqueror. Yet this moral high ground was built upon a deep sense of isolation. He had defeated the great king, but the victory felt incomplete because Darius himself survived. Alexander now possessed the symbols of Persian sovereignty, the women, the wealth, but the true prize, Darius's surrender, eluded him. He had won the battle, but not the war of wills. Historians still argue whether Alexander's respectful treatment of Darius's family was genuinely motivated by noble compassion, or if it was a calculated political move to win the loyalty of the Persian population and establish himself as the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne. Regardless, the gesture was masterful. Alexander had transcended the role of the vengeful invader. He was beginning to assume the mantle of the sovereign successor. With Darius in panicked flight and the heart of the Persian Levant open, Alexander did not immediately pursue the vanquished king. Instead, he made a calculated, symbolic detour south, marching through Phoenicia and laying siege to the mighty island city of Tyre. This decision was a testament to his integrated military and philosophical strategy. He was securing his flank and supply lines, yes, a move Aristotle would approve, but more profoundly, he was destroying every potential base for a Persian naval resurgence. The 8-month siege of Tyre, a mainstream historical fact of engineering brilliance and brutal persistence, demonstrated that Alexander's will could literally overcome nature. He built a massive causeway connecting the mainland to the island fortress. After Tyre's inevitable bloody fall, the path lay open to Egypt, a land steeped in mythologies far older and more pont than the tales of Troy. Alexander entered Egypt not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator from the unpopular Persian rule. The Egyptians, weary of the Achaemenid yoke, greeted him with open arms. It was here that Alexander would fully embrace the divine narrative his mother had always promised. His journey led him across the desert to the oasis of Siwa, home to the revered oracle of Amun. The trip itself was fraught with danger. Sources suggest the party lost their way and were saved only by a sudden rainstorm, or, in a more quirky tidbit, by 2 ravens who guided them across the shifting sands. This entire treacherous journey became immediate fodder for the mythmakers. The gods were actively shepherding their son. The encounter within the Temple of Amun was the psychological and spiritual zenith of Alexander's life. While the exact exchange remains obscure, guarded by the priests and perhaps by Alexander himself, the result was clear. The oracle confirmed his divine parentage. Alexander was proclaimed the son of Amun, This declaration transcended Greek myth. It plugged Alexander directly into the ancient living theology of Egypt. He was now Pharaoh, a living god on earth, bridging the Hellenic world with the African divine. This deification gave him a spiritual authority over the conquered lands that no Macedonian king could ever wield. The divine ambition planted by Olympius had found its absolute confirmation, yet this triumph of the spirit came with a chilling internal cost. By accepting the mantle of divinity, he drove a final decisive wedge between himself and his purely Macedonian generals. Men like Parmenion and Clitus, who had bled and fought alongside Philippos' son, struggled to bow before a pharaoh god who wore Egyptian vestments and claimed the sun as his father. The philosophical core of his leadership was changing from shared heroism to lonely divinity. In Egypt, he also founded the city of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile, a testament to his foresight and appreciation for Hellenic culture. He personally laid out the city's blueprint, a mainstream historical fact reflecting his commitment to creating a new cultural hub, a permanent beacon of Greek influence. But the journey to Siwa, the very moment he sought clarity and divine affirmation, also introduced a profound separation. Alexander now had secrets only shared with the high priests and himself. He carried a truth that isolated him, forcing him further onto the lonely pedestal of a living god. Historians still argue whether the priests of Amun genuinely believed Alexander was divine, or whether they simply recognized a strategic opportunity to secure favorable governance from the powerful invader by granting him the pharaonic title that legitimized rule in Egypt. For Alexander, the question was irrelevant. The oracle had spoken. He was invincible. He was ready to conquer the rest of the world, not as its master, but as its rightful divine sovereign. Leaving the eternal certainty of Egypt behind, Alexander faced the desert not as a geographical obstacle, but as a cleansing rite. He had secured his divine identity. Now he needed to complete the mortal chore, the final crushing defeat of Darius III. The stage for this ultimate confrontation was set far to the east, on the sprawling plains near the village of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq. The mainstream historical fact is that Darius had used the intervening time to assemble the largest, most diverse army the Macedonians had ever faced, including war elephants and scythed chariots. He had also meticulously leveled the battlefield at Gaugamela, seeking to negate the speed of the Macedonian cavalry and maximize the advantage of his chariots. This strategic preparedness showed Darius was fighting not just for his throne, but for the very survival of Achaemenid sovereignty. You are there on the eve of battle, October 1st, 331 BC. Parmenion, the cautious general who represented the grounded wisdom of the Macedonian Old Guard, advised Alexander to launch a surprise night attack, hoping to disrupt the vast Persian numbers. But Alexander, embracing his role as the son of Amun, refused. He needed the full light of day, the full view of his enemy, and the full testimony of the world to witness his inevitable glorious triumph. He declared that, "I will not steal my victory." This profound refusal underscored his commitment to his own mythology. Victory must be earned honorably, under the sun, to be eternal. The battle itself was a masterpiece of maneuver. Alexander deliberately extended his flanks, drawing the Persian cavalry wider, tempting them into a pursuit. When Darius launched his feared scythed chariots, a quirky tidbit of ancient warfare often more terrifying than effective, Alexander's veteran troops simply opened ranks, allowing them to pass harmlessly through before closing in for the kill. The climax arrived when Alexander executed his brilliant, feigned retreat. As the Persian cavalry was drawn away from the center in pursuit of the receding Macedonian flanks, a fatal gap opened near Darius's position. You see Alexander, leading the heavy companion cavalry in a terrible, focused wedge, plunging into that gap like a divine thunderbolt. The charge was perfectly timed and utterly devastating. Darius, witnessing the direct, terrifying charge aimed solely at his person, repeated the catastrophic mistake of Issus. He fled. This time the retreat was final. It fractured the Persian command structure instantly and irrevocably. The battle devolved into a massacre, though the Macedonians suffered heavy casualties, particularly Parmenions' contingent. Alexander had won. He was now, de jure and de facto, the great king of Persia. He entered the capitals of Babylon and Susa as a liberator and a legitimate successor, not merely a conqueror. But the psychological effect of this victory was terrifying. The immediate feeling was not triumph, but an unsettling vacuum. He had conquered the known world, fulfilled the destiny promised by the oracle, and eliminated his greatest rival. He stood on the empty throne of Darius, the symbol of absolute temporal power, yet felt a profound lack of resolution. The mortal chore was done, but the divine purpose remained elusive. The emptiness that followed Gaugamela marked the true beginning of Alexander's isolation. He had chased the ghost of his father's ambition across a continent, only to find the ultimate victory left him alone at the apex of power, with nothing left to conquer but his own soul. Historians still argue whether the Battle of Gaugamela was won primarily by Alexander's tactical brilliance or by Darius's strategic incompetence and cowardice. Regardless, the defeat sealed the fate of the Achaemenid Empire. For Alexander, the question was now, where do you go when there are no more borders left to defend or shatter? The conquest of Babylon and Susa was an act of effortless succession. Alexander entered those ancient Persian capitals not in the guise of a vengeful Macedonian, but as the legitimate, culturally sensitive successor to the Achaemenid throne. He treated the populace with respect, honored their traditions, and crucially, paid homage to their gods. This was Aristotle's lesson in political governance at its most refined. To rule the East, one must first become Eastern. However, the final, visceral act of separation from his Hellenic roots was yet to be committed. The campaign next led him to Persepolis, the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the Achaemenid Empire, the city that symbolized everything Persia had been and was meant to be. This was the city that Darius had built, a testament to Persian splendor, a vast storehouse of accumulated wealth and historical pride. The mainstream historical fact is that Alexander ordered the complete destruction of Persepolis in 330 BC. The reasons for this decision are layered with psychological complexity. Officially, it was vengeance for Xerxes' burning of Athens a century and a half earlier, a calculated political payback to appease his Greek allies and solidify his claim as the champion of Hellenism. Yet the act itself was impulsive, excessive, and ultimately detrimental to his long-term goal of integrating the Persian nobility. You stand amid the roaring flames, the marble columns of the great Apadana Hall collapsing into dust. This was no mere military strike, it was a deliberate erasure of the past. By destroying the physical embodiment of the Achaemenid dynasty, Alexander was ensuring that no subsequent Persian claimant could rally loyalty around the former center of their faith. He was clearing the ground for his own new, integrated sovereignty. But the most famous and quirky tidbit regarding this destruction involves the Athenian courtesan Thais. Allegedly, she was the one who, during a drunken celebratory feast, convinced Alexander to put the torch to the palace as a symbolic act of vengeance on behalf of Athens. This detail, that the fate of a monumental symbol of empire was decided in a fit of drunken revelry at the urging of a mistress, underscores the dangerous confluence of Alexander's political strategy and his volatile, often intoxicated emotional state. It suggests that the boundary between reasoned policy and personal whim had completely dissolved. The fire that consumed Persepolis was also a fire of isolation. As Alexander stood watching the symbols of Persian greatness turn to ashes, he was also burning the last bridge connecting him fully to the Macedonian ideal of a limited campaign of revenge. His original purpose was fulfilled, and now his journey had no historical precedent. He was marching into the void of his own escalating ambitions. The destruction was necessary for his psychological break from the past, confirming that his mission was now solely about his future, not the legacy of Greece or the revenge of Philippos. His generals, who had witnessed the calculated conquest and the respectful treatment of Darius's family, were stunned by this act of barbarism. It was a jarring contradiction that fueled the growing unease among the old guard. They followed him because he was a king. They struggled to follow a man who seemed to arbitrarily destroy the very treasures he had fought so hard to possess. Historians still argue whether the destruction of Persepolis was a planned act of retaliation by Alexander, intended to send a message of finality to the Persian world, or genuinely an impulsive, drunken error that he later came to regret. Regardless of the intent, the consequence was clear. He had made an irreversible statement about the nature of his rule, one defined by the beautiful, terrifying power to create and to destroy on a monumental scale. The burning of Persepolis created a psychological divide that no quantity of loot could bridge. Alexander was no longer merely the king of Macedon leading a Hellenic crusade. He was now Basileus of Asia, and his behavior was increasingly influenced by Persian custom, a calculated political move, but one that felt like betrayal to his battle-hardened veterans. The pursuit of Darius III led the army into the deep reaches of Bactria and Sogdiana, lands that were geographically remote and culturally resistant. This became the theater for the most tragic acts of Alexander's escalating paranoia. Darius was betrayed and murdered by his own satrap, Bessus, who then proclaimed himself Artaxerxes IV. Alexander, upon finding the body of his rival, the man who had defined his ambition for 6 years, treated the fallen king with immense ceremony, giving him a royal burial. This was not compassion, it was necessary mythology. By punishing Bessus, a Persian traitor, and honoring Darius, the legitimate king, Alexander solidified his claim as the true successor, legitimizing his rule in the eyes of the Persian nobility whom he desperately needed to govern his new empire. Yet, as the external threat diminished, the internal conflict intensified. Alexander's escalating adoption of Persian dress and court rituals, such as demanding his generals perform proskynesis, prostrating themselves before him, a Persian custom deemed idolatrous by the Greeks, created bitter resentment. This was the moment the rational student of Aristotle fully succumbed to the divine ambition of Olympias. He was demanding to be worshipped, and the Macedonians viewed it as an unforgivable insult to their tradition of free speech, parrhesia. The tension erupted into tragic violence in the execution of 2 of his most valued and loyal men. The mainstream historical fact is that Philotas, the son of the respected general Parmenion and commander of the companion cavalry, was accused of involvement in a conspiracy against the king. Under duress and perhaps torture, Philotas confessed. Alexander ordered Philotas's immediate execution. Crucially, the king then ordered the swift assassination of Parmenion himself back in Ecbatana, thousands of miles away, on the grounds that the father of a traitor could not be allowed to live. The death of Parmenion, a veteran who represented the last link to Philippos's era and the old Macedonian ethos, sent a shiver of fear through the ranks. Alexander had shown that loyalty and decades of service offered no protection against suspicion. The philosophical covenant between king and general, built on shared hardship and mutual respect, was broken, replaced by the capricious tyranny of a sovereign who believed himself above accountability. This period was also marked by the brutal, drunken murder of Clitus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander's life at Granicus. In a fit of rage during a banquet fueled by alcohol and Clitus's blunt, resentful criticism of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his self-deification, Alexander ran him through with a spear. The immediate, terrifying remorse that followed, Alexander had to be forcibly restrained from committing suicide, highlights the deep psychological instability and profound loneliness that accompanied his absolute power. He had killed the man who was both his savior and the last voice of honest, unflattering truth, a quirky tidbit illustrating his growing cultural schizophrenia. Alexander began training 30,000 native Persian youths, dubbed the Epigoni, successors, in Macedonian military techniques. This practical move to secure long-term military power further alienated his Macedonian veterans, who saw their irreplaceable status being systematically undermined. Historians still argue whether the paranoia that led to the execution of Philotas and Parmenion was justified by a genuine threat to Alexander's life, or whether it was an inevitable consequence of the stress of command and the cultural alienation from his homeland. Regardless, the blood spilled was Macedonian, and it made the king a prisoner of his own divine pedestal. The self-inflicted wounds of the purges, the deaths of Parmenion and Clitus, had fractured Alexander's relationship with his veterans, yet the physical demands of his divine quest left no time for healing. With the last vestige of the Achaemenid Empire subdued, his gaze fixed eastward toward a land of myth and rumor, India. This was the territory of the Indus, the legendary river Oceanus that marked, in the Hellenic mind, the ultimate border of the world. To conquer India was not merely to gain land, it was to complete the geographical and philosophical loop of civilization. The campaigns across the Indus River were grueling, marked by fierce battles against formidable local rulers like King Porus, whom Alexander defeated in the mainstream historical fact of the Battle of the Hyphasis River. This battle, fought in 326 BC, introduced the Macedonians to a terrifying new element of warfare, the war elephants. Alexander's victory was secured through brilliant maneuvering, but the cost was immense, the psychological toll of facing such colossal, unpredictable beasts draining the men's will. The deeper Alexander pressed, the more profound became his sense of destiny, but the more palpable became his men's exhaustion. He dreamed of reaching the Ganges River, of touching the Eastern Ocean, of closing the circle. He had transcended the achievements of his mortal father and even the mythological journeys of Heracles. Now he aspired to surpass the gods. His army, however, was composed of men, not demigods. They were tired of marching, tired of the relentless rain of the Indian monsoon, and terrified of the reports of even larger kingdoms and deadlier beasts that lay beyond. They had marched for 8 years, conquering empires, crossing unimaginable distances, and now they stood on the banks of the river Hyphasis, modern Bees. This river became the site of Alexander's greatest and most humiliating failure. You watch Alexander gather his officers and men, delivering impassioned, soaring speeches, reminding them of their shared glory, their divine mission, and the minimal distance left until they touched the ultimate symbolic ocean. He painted a vision of eternal renown, of a glory that would dwarf all human memory. The silence that met his oratory was heavy, thick, and utterly final. General Coenus, representing the exhausted will of the collective, spoke. He did not speak of treason or fear, but of home, of old age, of the wives and children they had not seen for a decade. He spoke of the human limit, the one boundary Alexander could not slash with his sword. The mainstream historical fact is that the army flatly refused to proceed further. This was a mutiny of exhaustion, not of malice. For Alexander, this refusal was a profound, catastrophic psychological blow. The son of Amun, the self-proclaimed Lord of Asia, had been defied by the very men he had led to divinity. He retreated to his tent for 3 days, refusing to see anyone, consumed by a volcanic rage and a sense of betrayal that transcended mere military insubordination. He had been betrayed by the flesh and blood he sought to lead toward immortality. This moment forced him to confront the ultimate humbling truth. He was bound by the needs and mortality of his men. The philosophical lesson learned at the Gordian knot, that destiny could be violently commanded, was brutally revoked at the Hyphasis. He could not, after all, command the human heart. In a poignant, quirky tidbit demonstrating his despair, Alexander ordered 12 massive altars to be built on the Hyphasis banks, marking the furthest point of his relentless pursuit, erecting gigantic monuments to his ambition even in defeat. He then ordered the army to turn back. The pursuit of the ultimate border had ended, not with the Pacific Ocean, but with the weary feet of his own troops. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely intended to conquer the whole of the Indian subcontinent, or whether his push to the Hyphasis was a final theatrical attempt to cement his legend before turning back to consolidate his vast, unwieldy empire. Regardless, the retreat was an acknowledgement that his will, though divine in scope, had met its human counterpoint. The rejection at the Hyphasis was a mortal wound to the soul of the self-proclaimed god. Alexander, in his profound fury and wounded pride, refused to acknowledge the human fatigue of his men. Instead, he interpreted their refusal as a cosmic betrayal. If he could not conquer the entire earth, he would punish his body and his army by choosing the most difficult route for the retreat, the brutal, largely unexplored desert of Gedrosia, modern Balochistan. This was an act of deliberate self-inflicted hardship, a penitential march driven by a desire to transcend the very human limits his army had imposed upon him. The mainstream historical fact is that the march through the Gedrosian Desert in 325 BC was an unmitigated disaster. The army suffered horribly from heat stroke, thirst, and starvation. Water vanished into the deep sands, supply columns were lost, and the landscape offered no respite. Estimates suggest that losses from the elements and disease rivaled those suffered in his major battles combined. The discipline of the army broke down into a savage fight for survival, a sharp and terrible contrast to the controlled, glorious violence of Gaugamela. You feel the parched, agonizing reality of the desert. This was not the mythological arena of Achilles. This was a wasteland where even the gods seemed to abandon their son. The king, in a quirky tidbit demonstrating his commitment to shared suffering or perhaps a desperate bid to win back loyalty, famously refused a helmet full of water offered to him by his men, pouring it onto the sand instead, stating that he would not drink while his men suffered. This act, though inspiring, highlights the dichotomy of his leadership, the grand gesture over the practical reality. During this grueling retreat, Alexander suffered a loss more personal and profoundly shattering than any military defeat: the death of his beloved horse, Bucephalus. The magnificent beast, his companion since childhood, the symbol of his very first triumph over his own fear, succumbed to old age and exhaustion near the Hyphasis River, before the Gedrosian March, but related to the punishing campaign. Alexander mourned Bucephalus fiercely, naming a city, Bucephala, in his honor. This was a deep emotional cut, confirming that even the emblems of his unique destiny were ultimately subject to mortal decay. He had lost his physical connection to that first, innocent promise of greatness. The march through Gedrosia served as Alexander's final brutal lesson from Aristotle. Nature always triumphs over will. His divine ambition had been humbled not by a rival army but by the indifferent cruelty of the sun and sand. The sheer physical suffering forced a psychological reckoning, a grim acceptance of the limits of his authority over the natural world. Upon finally emerging from the desert and reuniting with the fleet under Nearchus, Alexander faced widespread corruption and mismanagement by the governors and satraps he had left behind. The journey home became a purge of a different kind, a reckoning of accountability. He executed those who had abused their power, reasserting his absolute authority over the vast, unwieldy empire he had forged. This era marked the peak of Alexander's psychological isolation. He had alienated the old guard with his eastern ways, failed to conquer the ultimate border, and lost his most loyal animal companion. He was now solely reliant on his own judgment and the complex, conflicting narratives of his own divinity and his inescapable mortality. Historians still argue whether Alexander's decision to take the Gedrosian route was a tactical miscalculation based on flawed geographical intelligence, or if it was truly a deliberate act of self-flagellation and testing the endurance of his army to the absolute breaking point. What is undeniable is that the desert forever marked him, replacing the fire of Achilles with a deep, weary melancholy. The battered remnants of the army finally returned to the centers of civilization, emerging from the Gedrosian ordeal profoundly changed. The king, too, was changed. He was haunted by loss and consumed by the desperate need to consolidate his fractured empire through fusion, not just force. Having failed to conquer the physical boundary of the earth, Alexander pivoted to conquering the cultural boundary between East and West. He had to replace the failing Macedonian structure, which was prone to resentment and fatigue, with a new, unified Perso-Hellenic administration. The culmination of this ambitious political and philosophical project was the Susa weddings in 324 BC. The mainstream historical fact is that Alexander orchestrated a mass marriage ceremony between thousands of his Macedonian officers and soldiers and Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself married Statera, a daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, a daughter of Artaxerxes III, symbolically uniting the Macedonian and Achaemenid royal lines. You witnessed the lavish spectacle, the gold, the exotic Persian vestments, the ritualistic merging of two worlds. This was Alexander's crowning political statement. His empire was not a conquest, but a commonwealth, a grand shared destiny. The philosophical intent was brilliant. to forge an integrated ruling class, ensuring the Macedonians would have a permanent stake in Asia, and the Persians would have loyalty to the new dynasty. Yet this calculated attempt at fusion was met with immediate bitter resentment and alienation from the old Macedonian guard. They saw the adoption of Persian sons and wives not as cultural enrichment, but as a systematic degradation of their unique status. They had endured years of hardship to remain superior, only to see the king attempt to legislate their equality with the vanquished. This led to a profound mutiny, not of exhaustion, but of ideology, at the city of Opis. At Opis, the soldiers openly rebelled against the inclusion of Persian units and officers in the Macedonian ranks, demanding to be discharged and sent home. They viewed Alexander's eastern policies as the final, unforgivable betrayal of the Macedonian tradition. Alexander met the mutiny with terrifying severity and theatricality. He personally identified and arrested the ringleaders, executing them immediately. Then, in a brilliant psychological maneuver, he secluded himself for days, appointing Persian officers to high command and distributing lavish gifts to the Persian units, deliberately isolating the mutinous Macedonians. The Macedonians, consumed by guilt and fear, eventually capitulated, begging for forgiveness. This confrontation was the final tragicomic scene in the ongoing drama between Alexander's divine ideal and the mortal reality of his men's prejudice. He was forced to reconcile, giving a moving speech emphasizing their shared glory, but the relationship was fundamentally broken. Adding to the cultural confusion was the quirky tidbit that Alexander also ordered his generals, who had been commanded to marry at Susa, to discard their concubines and Persian mistresses. This attempt to enforce monogamy and moral rigor amidst his own plural marriages highlighted the deep hypocrisy and moral ambiguity inherent in his attempts to legislate cultural behavior. The king had achieved his political aim. He had purged the disloyal, enforced his policy of fusion, and confirmed that the capital of his empire would be Babylon, not Pella. He had utterly detached himself from the Macedonian past. Historians still argue whether Alexander's policy of fusion was a visionary stroke of genius that could have stabilized his vast empire for generations, or if it was merely a desperate, forced measure that prematurely alienated the Macedonian core upon which his power was built. Regardless, the atmosphere of suspicion and resentment settled heavily upon the court as Alexander returned to Babylon, the city of his final destination. Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BC, the ancient city of empire and the very nexus of his vast, volatile domain. The air in Babylon was thick with both the heat of the Mesopotamian summer and the suffocating weight of future planning. He had divorced himself from his Macedonian past and quelled the mutiny of his troops. Now, his restless mind was charting new, impossible voyages. He began planning campaigns to conquer Arabia, followed by a vast naval circumnavigation of Africa. He was determined to find the final true borders of the world, refusing to let the setback at the Hyphasis be the final chapter of his geographical destiny. You stand in the royal palace, a silent witness to the king's final days. The atmosphere was one of strained celebration, political tension, and creeping exhaustion. The king's body, hardened by a decade of relentless campaigning, was beginning to fail him. In a final symbolic rejection of all things purely Macedonian, he had been increasingly consumed by grand Persian-style building projects and massive logistical preparations, ignoring the growing discomfort within his own constitution. The mainstream historical fact is that Alexander fell suddenly ill in early June 323 BC after a prolonged bout of feasting and drinking. The fever was immediate, aggressive, The symptoms, high fever, extreme pain, and eventual loss of speech, have led historians and medical professionals to speculate endlessly about the cause. The fever burned his body for 11 agonizing days. His death was marked by a chilling, unresolved philosophical question. As he lay dying, already having lost the power of speech, his generals, the diadochi, successors who represented the very foundation of his empire, filed into his chamber. They asked the king the most critical question in the history of his newly forged world. To whom do you leave the empire? Alexander, struggling for air, allegedly managed only a whispered or gestured response to the strongest, toi kratistôi. This phrase, a devastating, quirky tidbit of historical ambiguity, was not a planned act of succession but a final, cynical surrender to the brutal logic of power he had both lived by and tried to transcend. It was the ultimate tragicomic rejection of Aristotle's political philosophy, which demanded order and structure. Instead of a carefully structured commonwealth, Alexander bequeathed chaos. Historians still argue whether Alexander was poisoned, either by Antipater, the Macedonian regent, or by factions fearing his continued policy of Hellenic-Persian fusion, or whether he succumbed to a natural cause such as malaria, typhoid fever, or pancreatitis exacerbated by years of excessive drinking and debilitating wounds. Regardless, the speed and finality of his death were terrifying. The moment Alexander drew his last breath, the vast, integrated empire he had forged through sheer force of will shattered. There was no air capable of holding the fragile construct together. The generals, bound only by Alexander's terrifying authority, immediately descended into decades of civil war, the wars of the Diadochi, breaking the world into Hellenistic fragments. The image you are left with is not of a king dying in glory, but of a man isolated by his own divinity, his final command being a cruel paradox that guaranteed the annihilation of his life's work. His greatest accomplishment, the geographical unification of the known world, was instantly reversed by his final fatal failure, the inability to secure his own mortality and plan for the human future. He had conquered the limits of the map only to be utterly conquered by the limits of the flesh. His pursuit of the eternal left the mortal world in eternal conflict. The fever burns now only in the memory of the sand. The echoes of the scythed chariots have faded, and the gold of Persepolis has long since dispersed into the rivers of time. You realize the grand journey of Alexander the Great. The pursuit that began with a childhood boast and ended on a desperate whisper was never truly about the conquest of land. It was the conquest of time itself, a quest for an eternal echo that would drown out the quiet certainty of mortality. He sought to prove the words of the oracle true, that he was indeed invincible, yet the final, ultimate conqueror was not Darius, nor any Greek rebel, but the simple, indiscriminate fever of the Babylonian air. His magnificent, ambitious life proves that you can cut the Gordian knot. You can ride beyond the borders of known civilization, but you cannot outrun the very human fragility written into your bones. The empire fractured, the generals fought, and the dream of fusion dissolved. But the myth of the boy who refused to be merely the son of a man, that survives. It survives not in the lines of power, but in the relentless philosophical question of what lies beyond. Close your eyes now. The king is asleep. The desert is quiet. There is only the long, quiet peace after the last loud battle. The borders have finally settled into silence.